Hi there, Claire. Thanks ever so much for agreeing to spend a bit of time with us today and sharing your perspectives on where we're at across the cultural sector during this sort of COVID-19 period, and perhaps as well where audiences and communities are at too. How are you doing?
Hi, Richard. Yeah, I'm okay. I believe we're at the end of the third week of lockdown, and Grantium has just crashed. So that about sums up, I think, the mood of everyone prior to the Easter weekend. Yeah, the intensity is something that strikes me. I think time both stretches out and intensifies in terms of our mood, our experiences, our exhaustion, our capacity to want to get things done. And I've been myself, I've got two girls, two daughters, one teenager, one 10, so they have different mood cycles too, which is has been interesting to manage. But I think
Sure.
I'm very conscious of in my own household and then across family, friends, and the community here. I've been really struck by everybody's very different experience. And Emily Maitlis last night, I don't know if you heard her on Newsnight, did this incredible cold address right at the beginning of the programme, in which she called out the inequity actually of the experience of COVID-19. And it was startling because of this sort of notion of we're in it together, whereas of course our own conditions and situation means that we're definitely not. So it feels like that's being drawn into the spotlight in a way maybe we haven't seen before. So I think I was keen to take this opportunity of a conversation with you, Richard, to address this question I've heard a lot from colleagues and artists and institutions, which is, what can I do? And there's a spectrum of responses to that, and I think on the one hand there's been this sort of binary division between productivity and repose on the one hand, somehow weirdly, or impotence, if you like, which is not particularly helpful, I don't think. And on the other hand, in the background I can hear a lot from colleagues and myself, which is a concern about irrelevance in this moment. You know, a feeling that somehow as creatives, as a creative and cultural industry, of course the things that people are needing in isolation are is the creative imagination to get them through this, but that sort of feels somehow less relevant and less urgent than the frontline key workers and key tasks. So I feel in the industry there's this sort of uneasiness, you know, and we've seen the amazing efforts of Slung Low and Eden Court and Coventry 2021 to reassign their resources and their skills to be useful. But I think for a lot of others, particularly individual artists, they may not have the resources or the skills or the capacity to be able to help in that way.
Yeah.
So I think this question of what can I do is particularly challenging for a creative practitioner, because of course we are by our very nature creative, which is that we are coming up with new ideas. We're coming up with new ideas of experiences. So the first thing to say is that I think the landscape has shifted. So the audience that you're addressing, their own conditions are completely different than they were 100 days ago. And therefore, that's a huge challenge for a creative practitioner to address an audience who you now have to get to know again, perhaps, in a different way. And you have to get to know how to work with colleagues and partners and collaborators and understand their boundaries and their capacities and their capabilities. So I think that the nature of the Zooms and the exhaustion of those is that you spend half of the Zoom finding out how everyone is, and then assessing whether the task that you were going to discuss is relevant at all anyway. So it's, you know, there's a lot of readjustment going on within that process. And I think in there's something potentially that we could do differently during this period if we have in our sights some semblance of recovery, either from an institutional point of view or an individual point of view. I mean, the first is that I spoke about in the panel discussion we did, so I won't go into huge detail on that, but one is obviously the first step is stabilization, and whatever that means for you. And there's some brilliant resources out there from Susan Royce and Dawn Langley's piece on immediate emergency actions to stabilise, from the actions of funders like Paul Hamlin and Arts Council to stabilise with emergency response funding, and to really think about the ways in which you can stabilise your financial model, whether that's on a small scale in your household or an institutional way. And of course, coming with that is the dreadful word unproducing, and the toil that takes to unpick something that was planned and to reschedule and reconfigure. And what I'm hearing a lot from organisations all over the UK is that the likelihood is that there is no fat on the bone. So essentially what we've got to look forward to is stripping everything back to essential work and creativity. So what does that mean? How can we begin to think about that where it doesn't feel like we are limited by that, or somehow that our dreams and our ambitions will never happen? And I think I guess what I was interested to watch this past couple of weeks is just imagine for a moment, let's take a contemporary art gallery, and imagine they've got an existing exhibition on and they've closed their doors, and those pictures and those installations are sitting there silently, not talking to anybody. And I was really struck by how what this has done is to make us aware that art was never a monologue. It was never mute. It was always social. And so in thinking about the future, perhaps when we strip away the artifice of the way in which things should be presented, or the theatre building, or the cafe out front, or the branding, or any of those things that all of us have spent so much time working on, we come down to essentially what is the transaction, what is the moment of dialogue with your audience. And as we see from the Arts Council's new strategy, Let's Create, we're moving to a time in which it's appreciated that we want to move towards a far more equitable and creative nation. And so therefore, perhaps the ways in which we have been supporting and producing those creative encounters is going to change. And this might allow us to think about how that happens and what kind of skills we might need in the future. So as a result, I think to think more about the civic action that we might have to learn about, the social engagement and how that occurs and how that might fundamentally change the way in which we work in the future, might be something that we want to start thinking about.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's really interesting. I love what you said about, it's always been true that art was never a monologue, was never mute. And this does put focus on that the space between the work and the participant or audience member or visitor, and how that's generated that space to experience and be affected and affect the work.
And then I guess the third thing put into that. So if the first is the kind of practical solutions and stabilization that we need to undergo to allow us a space to focus, to think creatively, and then to think about the social action, interaction. And the third for me would be about relevance and place, because if we've learned anything, suddenly we've looked out of our doors and looked at our neighbours in a way we never have before. We understand the local conditions of where we are, and we are putting down roots in a way we might not have before through enforced immobility. So that means that, so if you take that idea of thinking about stripping everything away to think about what's the essential value of what you do creatively, then to enrich that, I would say the essential value of what you do in a place. And you might work for a company, or your own practice might be peripatetic, so it might be in a number of places. It doesn't have to simply be in one. But I think there is something then about what value do you have, and I think I think we can see both the great beauty of work that's live streamed and the ability to, watch Jane Eyre tonight. Bristol Vic's production, live streamed, how glorious to disappear into that, but equally the paucity of that, equally the need to feel that you are in a social interaction within a theatre or in public space, for example. So I think there's those three things to sort of begin to think about, and to give you an example, I think I was doing a lot of kind of practical work this week in terms of planning and supporting and mentoring and working on things. And then I started to work with an artist on a potential project, and it just lifted me out of that headspace of the coping into the creative space. And it was almost the kind of impact that you have when you go for a run, the sort of the same sort of chemicals I think were sort of going on. So I think I would say to those who are feeling like if they even have a small amount of focus time to start thinking about a project creatively, that it does take you to a different space that you really miss, actually. And artists are usually the way in which are the kind of wayfinders for that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I really love the focus on what can I do, and your perspective. There's stabilisation, social engagement, and then relevance and place. I'm not surprised to hear you talk about relevance and place.
Yeah.
And I'm delighted that you are, and I'm delighted that you've kind of brought out what's current about that consistent and constant area of focus. And I love the idea. I love that you've noticed the experience of connecting with artists directly. And
I think there's something interesting about place, which is that I hope that what we might experience in the next few months is our understanding of place is not that it's a stable thing, a located thing, but that it is influenced by duration and influenced by politics and economics, and it's changing on a daily basis. And that in a way, if you have a much more sophisticated understanding of place, what it enables you to do is to create work that has resonance and relevance locally, as opposed to being about place. So that's often a kind of mistake, I think, when people are thinking about relevance and place. They think they have to make it about the place, whereas actually it's about understanding how something will land or something will connect with people. And I, as a result, I hope that we'll be able to use the strategies that I think COVID will give us, which is actually putting on clothes that we haven't worn before, So talking to people in ways we haven't before, feeling that actually time's too short to not actually reach out to people and connect to people and use different skills. And hopefully that will enable us to create those kind of greater connections.
It's wonderful. I really love that. I really love that distinction you're drawing out around uh, how to create work that's relevant and resonates. I remember you talking before about kind of place being in a constant state of becoming.
Yeah, Doreen
That,
Massey. It's the geographer Doreen Massey.
And I love that. I love that in articulation. And I certainly, as you say, right now, I can certainly see that to be true in my street.
Yeah.
Or, I can certainly see that to be true in our relationships and in our orientation and the stories that we're feeling about our places.
Certainly true that I think, almost going full circle to the beginning of this conversation, that if there's a greater sensitivity to other people's situation and condition, which I think all of us are already feeling in our bubble of the arts and culture sector, seeing each other's home lives and understanding boundaries in a way we haven't before, and there's a greater degree of generosity, I think, right now. Then I wonder if we can take that through into the way in which we think about culture producing and relevance, because if we have a greater understanding of people's own circumstance, capabilities, capacity to engage, that's what's needed, really. And I think that going forward, the Arts Council's Let's Create strategy will therefore also need to support the skilling up of a workforce in really thinking about engagement strategies in a way that we never have done before, so that we're not operating within a bubble. If we're truly relevant and we're truly engaged in that activity of creativity, it's going to need us to have very different kinds of skills.
Beautiful. Thank you. Claire, will you, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Yeah.
You come back in a few weeks
and
have another conversation.
Sure. Everything will have changed.
Exactly. Like the world will again be in a different place. It'd be brilliant to kind of, if it's okay with you, to like keep a constant conversation going about how it looks from where you're at. Sure. So thanks ever so much for finding time to speak with us today, Claire.
Pleasure. Thanks,
Thank
Richard.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.